Hi, and welcome to our presentation on the future of advertising and whether neuroscience has the answer. So first of all, just some introductions. My name is Neil Davidson. I'm CEO of HeyHuman, and I'm joined by Aoife, who is HeyHuman's neuroscience consultant. I just also want to set the context for us as an agency and how we focus on neuroscience and how it's changing what we offer creatively. So our focus is on unusual everyday ideas, which is going to fit into what we're going to talk about today. So what we've learned over the last 6 years is that the most effective creative work is a balance of the unusual and the everyday, but it's also a balance of the unusual and the everyday that most advertising agencies see slightly different to the reality. So what we do is we use neuroscience research for both insight from concept stage to execution, but we also have that within ourselves as an agency. So within HeyLab, we have neuroscience kit for testing concept strategies, ideas, and executions. And we create that at Hey Studio so we can test throughout the cycle. And we're focused on delivering that in brand, content, digital, social, and experiences. What we'll cover today is, we'll start with what do we really know about how advertising works? And then we'll get into which myths actually block real creatively effective advertising, and also how neuroscience is helping unblock some of those myths. And then we'll talk about what those insights tell us about what creative advertising could look like in the future, based on some of the learnings that we've uncovered so far. And then we'll use a real-time example of how we are using neuroscience to sort of inspire creativity now. So advertising, I think, it's actually quite a mature industry now. It's been around over 2 centuries. And obviously over time, many models and many myths have grown. So, different agencies, different schools of thought have different models for how they believe advertising works and why they should do that. And also, it's based on many things that we're starting to uncover are actually myths about how advertising works. So I just want to talk a little bit more about that. So I'll focus on sort of four sort of key myths. There are others, but I think these are the key ones that we need to focus on at the minute. And then the first one is that advertisers have to battle for attention. And that's really based on implicit and explicit beliefs that for advertising to work, we need people to sort of engage at a higher cognitive level with it. That people actually need to consciously pay attention to advertising for it to work. And also, in terms of that higher cognition, there's a belief that there's a sort of hierarchy of advertising effects, which, most people would know as we think, then we feel, and therefore we do something. So it builds on each other. And there's actually no empirical evidence of that. In fact, there is a lot of empirical evidence, including neuroscience, that it just doesn't work in that hierarchical way. And then because of that belief in attention and because of that belief in a hierarchy of effects, advertisers and agencies believe that we have to stand out as much as possible to create that cognition and to create those memories and associations. And therefore, we must always be different to the competition. And there's quite a lot of empirical evidence and neuroscience learnings that show that that kind of logic of those four myths that sit together just aren't true, particularly starting with we think, feel, and then do. So in terms of where that gets us in terms of how we work as an industry, one of the kind of big things, and is whether you're creative or just a practitioner generally, is a belief in creativity through gut feel. And that is based on we intuitively know when advertising affects us. So therefore we know what ideas are right, what ideas are wrong. And also we intuitively therefore know how it's going to affect other people. Now, what we're not saying is gut feel doesn't have a place, but there's actually a way to kind of use gut feel and really understand the why behind that. And that's really where neuroscience comes into its own. And then I mentioned many models, and there are many, many models, and these are just some of them. And I think the fact that we can pull out at least 6 models that are prevalent in the industry at the moment tells you that there is no one understanding of how advertising works, particularly how it works with our brains. But just to pick out a few, the think model, which is just focused on cognition, and you might have known way back when as a unique selling proposition, focuses on the fact that one message is absorbed by our brain and therefore advertising does its job. The most prevalent model that still hangs around is the think, feel, do model that I mentioned already, AIDA, and we've already talked about how that has been proven not to work, but I'll also talk about how neuroscience unpicks that. And then there's other models that have a flavor of think, feel, and do, but either prioritize it differently, like a focus on think, do, and then feel with awareness trial reinforcement model, which is much more lower engagement, leading to action, leading to emotions later, or feel, think, do, which actually, yet again, has lower cognitive engagement. But then you get onto newer models like the perception, experience, memory model and the EE space that are starting to get closer to the reality of how advertising works with us. So cognition has a role, feelings or affect have a role in the doing, the behavior, but they are definitely not fixed. And context has a massive influence in that, both personal context and category context. And I think a really interesting way to look at it is system 1 and system 2, thinking about how our brain operates. Now, I think a lot of people in the industry are aware of system 1 and system 2. I think the challenge may be that it's been slightly oversimplified when actually it can be used to debunk many of the myths about advertising. But, headline is obviously system 1 is our long-term evolutionary functions of our brains, which are more immediate, intuitive, quick response. System 2 are the workings of our brain that evolved over time and are more about the thinking piece, the higher cognition piece that you would argue that quite often the think, feel and do model has. And I think, what's really important about that different perspective is what we're really talking about is dual process reasoning. Now, Kahneman has been made famous by System 1 and System 2, but he's certainly not the first academic to notice that and prove it. I think the really important thing about dual process reasoning is it shows that we come to advertising in terms of cognition and our brains in different ways. We are more system 1 and system 2 than we want to believe. So much more of how we respond to information like advertising is much more intuitive, shallow, and involves lower cognition. We are more human than econ. So human being, the emotive system 1 type responses, econ being the rational, considered responses, which, yet again is higher cognition, which we actually believe is less and less involved in advertising. But also Kahneman says we see the world through memories of experiences rather than experiences themselves, which actually shows there is a role for advertising in terms of shaping how our brains engage with the world, because advertising can be part of that framing of how we see brands in the world. It's just how we see it and how these kind of concepts of the dual process reasoning challenge kind of legacy assumptions of how advertising really works now. And then a final point in terms of, we work as an industry to a model that is particularly based around higher level cognition, but then we create work that focuses on learning from qual research, which actually asks people to verbalize processes going on in silence in your mind. And that's a quote from Daniel Kahneman. But really the point is, because of system 1 and system 2, we can't actually verbalize what's really going on in our mind and why we made decisions that are so immediate and impulsive. And yet we rely on qualitative research to help us to do that, when everything we are learning about the brain shows that that is at best difficult, but in other ways impossible. So the good news is we know a lot now about how advertising doesn't work, and a lot about legacy models, legacy myths have been unpicked. But the even better news is we now know a lot more about how it actually does work. And I'm now going to hand over to Aoife, who's going to talk about what neuroscience has taught us about how advertising does actually work.
So I'm going to talk about your brain on advertising. I think the first thing to kind of really point out here is that most ads are actually processed subconsciously or with very low kind of conscious involvement. In fact, they say up to 95% of our decisions are made subconsciously, which is pretty insane. So this kind of harks back to what Neil was saying about system 1 and system 2. So 95% of our decisions are this system 1 thinking. System 2 is effortful, so we go for system 1. And in fact, the decision-making is largely driven by emotion. We are driven by our emotions, and emotions are what kind of motivate us then to kind of either ignore or respond to a stimulus. And motivation is really the driving force of behavior change. It underpins everything we do in life, whether that be intrinsic motivation or kind of intrinsic motivation. However, that's not just everything that's involved. We know that memory, it kind of frames our experiences with brands, and it also shapes our identities. Brands are in essence memory webs, and cognition controls how much we can attend to or engage with some content. This is largely determined by cognitive load. So cognitive load is the total amount of mental effort in working memory, and is often seen as a gateway between sensory input and long-term memory encoding. And what happens is when you have too much cognitive load, you have a breakdown essentially in this gateway. And so you have a disruption in what normally would be encoded into memory. So in combination, all of these factors determine if we connect with some advertising or not. So last year as an agency, we decided to research if there was a kind of a formula for great creativity in advertising, if we could predict if an ad was going to be connective or not. So we tested 6 of the best ads of all time that are considered by creatives and the public alike to be examples of great creativity. We used EEG to record people's brain responses, and we then looked at the results. So now we're just going to have a quick look at what some of those ads were, and then I'm going to take you through the results.
Themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
I live a life of exhilaration,
of missed heartbeats and adrenaline.
And, if the truth be known,
a life of dubious virtue.
So, I'm assuming most of you kind of know all of those ads, or at least recognize them. So we have Apple's 1984, Sony's Bravia Balls, PlayStation Double Life, we have Sony Bravia Paint, Apple Unlock, and Apple Welcome Home. So 6 very famous ads, all heralded for their creativity. But how do they perform when we look at people's brain responses? So again, we looked at 3 different metrics here. The first metric being engagement. And what we found was that Apple's 1984 and Sony's Bravia Balls scored the highest here. And I think what's really interesting about engagement that we'll get onto in a minute is that it's a term often kind of that we obsess about in this industry, but it's not necessarily most important when it comes to advertising success. For motivation, it was Sony Bravia Balls and PlayStation's Double Life that scored the highest. So motivation is, again, this approach or avoidance behavior. Approach meaning that we kind of go towards a stimulus, and avoidance meaning we kind of avoid it. So again, this is quite indicative of emotion and how positive or negative we feel towards something. And then finally, we have cognitive load. And what was really interesting here was that Sony Bravia Balls scored the highest at cognitive load, and PlayStation Double Life actually scored the lowest. And so when you look at Sony Bravia Balls, it's kind of difficult to say, how is this cognitively overloading? But I think the point here to remember is that cognitive load is essentially the kind of the ability to maintain conscious awareness and kind of keep up with the ad throughout. And because it kind of lacks any kind of narrative, perhaps the brain kind of struggles to cling on to something. There's lots of beautiful abstract images of balls flowing around, but actually there's not the same kind of engaging narrative in people like PlayStation Double Life is. We find it a lot more easier to follow that kind of story versus something a little bit more abstract. But I think what was most important here was this kind of relationship between cognitive load and recall, or kind of recognition. So we found that there was actually an inverse relationship with cognitive load and recall, meaning that the more cognitive load, the less likely you are to remember something. And we didn't find any relationship between engagement and recall. So again, as an industry that speaks so much about engagement, it doesn't seem to be able to predict actually if someone's going to remember or kind of recognize your ad. So when it came to recognition, a lot of people were able to kind of say that, oh, when they saw a couple of seconds of Bravia Balls, oh yeah, I've seen this before. But when it came to actually saying which brand it was, many people could not. Actually, the majority of people couldn't. And it was like 12% of people could actually ascertain that it was Sony. A lot of people misattributed it to be Panasonic and other brands. So again, this recognition element of memory is more the implicit memory. So again, they may have kind of subconsciously seen it, they see those balls, they recognize it, but actually that more explicit memory coding was just not there. Contrast that with PlayStation Double Life, where we saw less people recognizing it overall, perhaps because the ad had less kind of general public appeal and widespread reach. Those who did see it, saw it, kind of remembered it for sure it was PlayStation Double Life, 50% of people. So it was so kind of intrinsically linked to the brand, that narrative of the ad, that people were unable to kind of say any other brand. Of course, it was Sony Double Life. So here for us, the really important key is cognitive load and how that relates to memory. So as an agency, we've kind of worked since then this to look at what are the metrics that really matter when it comes to connecting with people. And these are engagement, motivation, and memorization. So memorization kind of being inverse to cognitive load in the sense of, the more kind of memorization here in this case, the better. So we put these together into a composite score, which makes the Human Connection Index, which is essentially our way of measuring whether content is connecting with people or not, which essentially is the essence of great creativity. Essentially, we're trying to put some science to this gut feel, measuring what before was actually immeasurable. So now I'm going to pass back to Neil, who's going to talk you through some work.
Brilliant. Thanks, Aoife. I think what's really important for us is obviously unlocking how advertising really works to make better creative work based on the research, but it's also applying a sort of neuroscience mindset to creative work that we are doing now. And Guinness and the work that we did and we describe as Guinness Flavor Rooms is a really good example of that, because the brief to get people to like the liquid, the challenging but enjoyable eventually liquid that is Guinness is a tough one to get people to like it as much as the brand, really. And so when we looked at this brief recently, what we said is, normally we would just focus on getting people to taste it and sort of experience it. But actually what we tried to do was think, actually, how do we dimensionalize the senses of the liquid, etc., to just engage people differently, understanding that there's more than just sort of taste and the different ways to engage. And for us, that got us to a very different solution to anything that we've done with Guinness before.
I run away for some time into a universe of senses. Power pouting on my senses. Pouting on my senses.
So in conclusion, I think, advertising still has the power to entertain, amaze, and change lives. But I think how this has done this is often been misunderstood. And I think by really understanding how our brains engage with advertising, we can add the why to the gut feel that we talked about already. And for us, neuroscience is massively helping us answer the why, and definitely will continue to do so. So thanks very much for your time. If there's any sort of particular interest or questions, you can contact us. Our email address is at HeyHuman. Thank you very much.